Welcome back to Unfair Housing. I'm Morgan Cardinal, and with me is Alicia Magazoo. Today we'll be discussing installment contract sales and their role in shaping housing segregation in our communities. As a reminder, this podcast is not meant to be an exhaustive discussion of the history of housing segregation and housing discrimination. Nor is it meant to create division or instill guilt, but rather to educate our listeners on what shaped our neighborhoods and our social perspectives so we can be better guided in our efforts to improve our future and avoid repeating the mistakes of our past. We welcome your comments and lively discussion on the topics we raise, but we ask that you use kindness and consideration when making and responding to comments, and that you refrain from using threatening or violent language. Okay, let's get into it. Like we discussed in previous episodes, Black Americans had extreme difficulty purchasing a home, difficulty most white homebuyers didn't. Most notably for today's discussion, Black homebuyers face bank policies that refuse loans to Black borrowers trying to buy in white neighborhoods and that refuse to lend in Black neighborhoods at all. So what options did Black Americans have to achieve the American dream of homeownership? One option was they could purchase a home under an installment contract. And while not all contract sales were entered with the intention to deceive the buyer, that was the general intention of many contract sellers, particularly those who were solicitors who obtained ownership to the home through blockbusting tactics. In this episode, we'll look at these practices in Chicago, Illinois, where the practice of contract sales really thrived. At this time, an installment contract seemed like a good deal for Black homebuyers, in part because it was basically the only option that offered a chance at the American dream of home ownership. An attractive feature of buying a home on contract was it allowed a buyer to pay over time like a mortgage. But contract sales were much riskier than mortgages because they were less regulated. A typical installment contract story of the mid-1900s looks something like this. A Black buyer was offered a sales price by a broker that was usually significantly more than the purchase price paid by the seller. Often the seller and the broker were the same person. Of course, that information was not shared with contract buyers. Knowing the buyers had little to no other options to purchase a home, the brokers convinced the buyers to buy the home even if the price was more than the buyer could afford, a risk that was actually beneficial to the broker. Why? Because installment contracts typically required a down payment of at least 20% of the inflated sales price. And as we'll discuss further in just a bit, evicting a contract buyer was cheap. Further, the monthly payments under these types of contracts were significantly higher than what white families paid for new homes in the suburbs. Inevitably, contract buyers would fall behind in making their payments, and even in cases where the buyer paid enough to the seller to cover what the seller originally paid for the property, the buyers were evicted for non-payment. They lost all the monthly payments they made, and they lost their down payment. The seller would then turn around and start the process all over again with a new buyer. So I'm sure you can see the appeal here for the seller. One property had the potential to be a never-ending source of significant revenue. The impact this practice had on Black homeownership and Black wealth was monumental. A 2019 study conducted by Duke University, the University of Illinois, and Loyola University determined homes sold on contract in Chicago's Black neighborhoods in the 1950s and 60s were marked up on average 84%. Meaning, say a buyer purchased property for $10,000, that same buyer would turn around and resell that property to a Black buyer for $18,400. Unfortunately, somewhere between 75% and 95% of homes sold to Black Chicagoans were sold on contract. The result of these practices over the 20 years studied was a significant loss of Black wealth with a value between $3.2 and $4 billion. That statement merits repeating. Over 20 years in one city alone, $3.2 to $4 billion was stripped from Black families. And those are conservative values that don't take into account lost wealth for which data is missing. But let's take a step back to remind ourselves what conditions led to a market for selling homes on installment contracts to Black homebuyers. In the early 20th century, many Blacks migrated north to escape racial tensions in the South. And as we've discussed, this helped spur policy and action that made housing for Black Americans scarce and expensive. Many of these actions were taken by banks. Recall redlining and the refusal to lend to Black homebuyers. Between 1950 and 1960, the Black middle class, which ironically kept 85% of its savings in white banks, grew 20 times larger. So this was a huge market with purchasing power that went untapped by conventional lenders and investors. In fact, in 1959, a Black real estate agent from Chicago surveyed all of the savings and loan institutions in the city and discovered of the 243 institutions, only 2 were Black owned. Only 21 would make a loan to a Black home buyer trying to buy a home in a Black neighborhood, and only 1 of the 241 white-owned institutions would approve a mortgage if a Black home buyer wanted to buy a home in a white neighborhood. Only 1. So the inability to purchase created a high-demand rental market where landlords had the freedom to charge Black tenants higher rents because Black residents had few to no other housing alternatives. And despite receiving higher rents, these market conditions meant landlords had very little incentive to maintain their properties, and many didn't. During the Second Great Migration, the Black population in Chicago nearly tripled, but the amount of available housing to Black Chicagoans did not. Generally, only 2 neighborhoods were open to Black residents: the South Side's Black Belt and Lawndale. Even before the influx caused by the Second Great Migration, apartments in these neighborhoods were often subdivided into smaller units, some lacking electricity, many requiring multiple families to share a single bathroom, sometimes up to 9 families at once. In January 1958, these practices and conditions led to tragedy. 3 fires broke out that month, killing many of the occupants who lived in the subdivided buildings, including several children. Walls and doors had been added without permits and against code due to lack of access to an exit in the event of a fire. To give you an idea of just how dangerous this was, one of the fires occurred at a property built in 1884, which was originally an 8-unit apartment building but had been converted into 27 units. The fire claimed the lives of 7 children. The solution the city came up with was to crack down on enforcement of building codes and to impose fines for violations. There were 2 problems with this plan. 1, code enforcement was approached with some of the changes made to these buildings. One of the buildings that burned had been subdivided following approval from a code enforcement employee, and a second inspector persuaded the owner to hire workers from his own construction company to complete the illegal subdivision. So at least in some instances, it wasn't that code enforcement was not consulted, but that profit took priority over the risk to human life. 2, if the city's plan was implemented, it would leave many Black Chicagoans homeless. With white neighborhoods off limits to them and regulations that prohibited subdividing what housing Black Chicagoans were allowed to occupy, they had nowhere else to go. All of these conditions together created a perfect environment to hatch a scheme to deplete Black Chicagoans of their savings by appealing to their hopes to leave these deteriorated neighborhoods. This market reality birthed the idea of selling homes on installment contracts. Some real estate agents, or solicitors as they were often called, realized there was a great deal of money to be made if they could acquire property in white neighborhoods and resell it to black buyers, commonly referred to as blockbusting. This was particularly true if they could convince the white owner to sell quickly and often at a below market rate, which they did by instilling fear in residents the neighborhood was changing and would soon lose value because blacks were moving in. There were several big players in Chicago who made a significant living off installment contracts. One was Lou Fouchanis. His tactics, like most, were to inflate the prices of the buildings he sold on contract and offer monthly payments he knew the buyer wouldn't be able to sustain over time. He also made sure whatever repairs the buildings needed, which were many, were largely the responsibility of the buyer. Together, these practices helped ensure the buyer would default. Some of his buildings were sold 3 to 4 times. And while he died at the mere age of 42, he left behind an estate worth around $3 million, which consisted of over 600 buildings he owned individually and another nearly 270 he co-owned with another notorious contract seller in town, Mo Foreman. We'll take a quick break, and when we return, Alicia will tell us about another major player in contract sales in Chicago.
Hey folks, Nicole here. We hope you're enjoying the Unfair Housing podcast so far. Thank you for joining us, and remember, if you or someone you know is experiencing housing discrimination, or if you'd like to schedule a fair housing training, contact our Fair Housing Unit at 800-875-8785. To see if you qualify for other legal assistance, contact the CLS helpline at 800-405-1417. And don't forget, give us a like and a follow, and please share the series with your friends and family. Also be sure to follow CLS on Instagram, Facebook, and X. You can also visit our website at legalaccessforall.org.
Welcome back. Jay Garan made a great deal of money from blockbusting white neighborhoods and reselling on installment contracts to black buyers. Take Sally and Albert Bolton, for example. The Boltons lived in a small kitchenette apartment in the Black Belt of Chicago with their 4 children. The space was much too small for their family and was close to a shop used to strip wooden furniture. Tired of the lack of space and horrible smell, the Boltons began looking for somewhere else to live. They heard about a home in a nearby white neighborhood with good schools. It was owned by Jay Garan, a white real estate agent and lawyer. He offered to sell the home to the Boltons on contract for $13,900 with a down payment of $750 and a monthly payment of $110. The home was still a bit small for the Boltons' 6-member family, but Garan assured the couple they could move somewhere else later and transfer all the money they had paid toward this home into another home he owned. Satisfied, the Boltons proceeded with the purchase. Now, you may be thinking this sounds like a pretty good deal for a home, but keep in mind, white Chicagoans at this time could purchase a brand new home in the suburbs for $5,000, so less than half the sticker price for the Boltons' home, with a down payment of only $550. And their monthly payment on an FHA-backed mortgage was about $30. The distinction between buying a home with a mortgage rather than with an installment contract is significant, and I'll explain why shortly. The discriminatory sales price and terms were not the only issues the Boltons faced, however. Shortly after they moved in, additional unexplained fees were added to their payments, and they faced a multitude of code inspections that resulted in hundreds of dollars in repairs. In time, the expenses proved too much, and the Boltons fell behind on their payments. Garan responded swiftly by filing a forcible detainer action to remove them from the home, and it wasn't long before new prospective buyers began stopping by the house. At this point, the Boltons stood to lose $3,000 between the down payment, monthly payments, and the repairs, and there was little they could do to defend against the upcoming loss. You see, installment contracts were much riskier for buyers than traditional mortgages because they didn't offer the same protections as a mortgage. Non-payment under an installment contract led to a quick eviction process rather than a more structured foreclosure process. Another major difference between the two was the timing of transfer of ownership. In a typical home sale, just like we're used to in Florida today, title was transferred by the seller to the buyer at the time the home was purchased. But a buyer who purchased a home on contract did not get title until all the payments under the contract were made. Additionally, buyers did not gain equity through the life of the contract. This meant the payments they made did not give them any proportional ownership interest in the home. It was an all-or-nothing situation until title was transferred from the seller to the buyer. This was particularly significant because there were also no protections for the buyer if the owner sold the property. The contract buyer's interest was not recorded in public record because contracts were not recorded like mortgages were. And the contracts used in home contract sales did not require any future buyer or owner of the home to honor the contract for sale. So a contract seller could sell the property to someone else, keep all the money received through the contract sale, and leave the contract buyer with nothing. Further, installment contracts did not include language that prohibited the seller from taking out mortgages or acquiring other liens that used the property as collateral. This meant even if the buyer did make all their payments on time to get title to the property, it could very easily come with debt racked up by the contract seller. Unwilling to walk away from their investment, the Boltons sought help from local attorneys Mark Satter and Favell Burns. Shortly after taking on the Boltons' case, Satter discovered Garan had filed about 30 other eviction proceedings in just 1 month's time. While foreclosure proceedings for unpaid mortgages cost anywhere from $100 to $300 per filing, evictions for missed payments on homes purchased on contract only cost $4.50 to file. Yet another attractive feature of contract sales to solicitors like Jay Garan. Satter and Burns faced an uphill battle representing the Boltons. Illinois law didn't provide a defendant in an eviction proceeding an opportunity to provide a defense. All that mattered was whether the defendant received notice and whether the defendant had paid rent. But Burns came up with an idea that would give the Boltons the opportunity to argue their side. The legal theory was known as judicial fiat. The idea was the offending party, in this case the seller or broker, had done something so unreasonable to the plaintiff, the court had to intervene. So they filed a new lawsuit against Garan and his associate under this legal theory. The case addressed all the misinformation, dishonesty, and price gouging Garan engaged in to get the Boltons to purchase on contract. They also addressed Garan's duty as a real estate agent and attorney to work in the best interest of his client rather than himself, which he failed to do when he sold his property to the Boltons at a markup of 4 times what he paid days before. Unfortunately, the judge did not agree with Burns' legal theory. Rather, the prevailing arguments were made by Garan's attorney, who argued Garan had no fiduciary duty to the Boltons based on the conversations they had regarding the purchase. The price Garan placed on the building was merely his opinion, rather than a misrepresentation of fact, and the changes to the contract the Boltons sought in this case could not be made on an opinion, rather than a misrepresentation of fact. The Boltons lost their investment and were ordered to leave their home in early 1959. By 1960, Garan started the process all over again, selling the building to another black family for $14,000 with a down payment of $1,000, even though the home was still only worth around $4,300. The Boltons were not the only black family with this experience, nor were they the only family to seek help from Mark Satter. Numerous families secured Satter's counsel to fight back against the unconscionable installment contracts. Their battles were compounded by newly passed legislation in 1956 during the reign of Mayor Richard Daley that required extensive alterations to these poorly constructed homes to meet new local building codes, repairs the buyers were required to make. Just like the Boltons, each of these families, overwhelmed by repair costs and monthly contract payments, fell behind and lost their court battles to retain their homes or see the return of their investments, freeing these properties to yet again travel the same revenue road for their white owners. Attorney Mark Satter was very dedicated to his work and bringing light to the unconscionable practices of selling homes to black buyers on contract. His own research indicated black Chicagoans faced a cost of approximately $1 million per day simply for being black. He gave countless speeches throughout Chicago discussing the exploitive practices of contract sales used on black Chicagoans, the tactics of contract sellers, and the creation of the market fueled by savings and loans redlining practices. Much to his credit, Satter was able to help some people as a result of his efforts. He garnered a great deal of media attention, which led to settlement agreements for some, but in other cases led to disputes in court. Another element of contract sales that made them risky is they could contain a balloon payment, meaning that after a set number of years of making payments, a final, often large, lump sum payment was due. As mentioned, it was common practice for solicitors to convince black buyers to sign an installment contract, knowing it would allow the contract seller to evict when the buyer defaulted. In this instance, solicitors knew black contract buyers would struggle to find the money to pay the lump sum because getting a mortgage for the balloon payment was nearly impossible at this time. To convince the buyers to go through with the purchase, the sellers assured them they would help them get a mortgage when the time came. This is precisely what happened to Johnny and Mary Lou James, who purchased a home on contract from Charles M. Peters, a home he claimed was owned by an elderly white couple, but was actually owned by him. After 3 years of making payments, the Jameses tried to get a mortgage. They were rejected by 6 banks, in part because the amount they needed to satisfy the remaining payment on the contract far exceeded the market value of the home, and in part, of course, because they were black. So they sought the promised assistance from Peters, but he had no interest in helping them. It wasn't in his financial interest to help them. Instead, the investor who purchased the contract from Peters was free to evict the Jameses, and the process started all over again with another buyer. You see, an additional element to contract sales was the involvement of investors, which helped fuel the schemes with capital. Oftentimes, a contract seller would sell the contract to an investor at a reduced price, enough for the seller to make a decent profit and obtain cash to purchase new property. In exchange, the investor got an income flow from the buyer's installment payments at a discount. And then, of course, there were the really elaborate schemes where contract sellers lied about the sales price, offered to help their buyers secure mortgages, yes, plural, one that covered the actual sales price of the house, and another secured with the help of a financial institution that went right into the pocket of the seller and his co-conspirators. Thankfully, this was one scheme the courts didn't agree was just. On appeal, Mark Satter was able to convince the appellate court the actions of the contract seller and financial institution were a flagrant disregard of the law and the principles of fair dealing. But what happened when the buyer made all the necessary payments under their installment contract? Unfortunately, the property didn't always get transferred to the contract buyer. Take Henry and Elizabeth Shelton, for example, another one of Mark Satter's clients. In 1957, the couple purchased a home on contract for $9,950 from Adolph Lewis, who was both the real estate broker and the owner of the property. Though again, that was not disclosed at the time the sale was agreed to. Also not disclosed was the fact that Lewis purchased the home for $3,500 a week before selling it for $9,950 to the Sheltons. Lewis also concealed that he employed the lawyer who gave the Sheltons advice and helped convince them to proceed with the purchase. The Sheltons lived in the home for 6 years and diligently made all their payments. As the contract neared full payment, Lewis realized he'd have to take action to ensure he did not lose his revenue source to this black family. So he changed the locks to the home and claimed the reason was because they had fallen behind on money owed to the federal government. Lewis prepared an agreement to remedy the matter, or so the Sheltons thought, but it turned out the document was a quitclaim deed that transferred any interest the Sheltons had in the property to Lewis. In total, the Sheltons paid over $8,000 to Lewis and spent $2,300 repairing the property, and they lost it all. Just like with the Boltons, the court found there was no misrepresentation of fact and there was no fiduciary relationship or duty owed to the Sheltons, despite Satter's efforts to show otherwise. Lewis, on the other hand, made around $7,000 in profit and kept the property, meaning he could do the same thing to another family. Mark Satter dedicated his legal career to solving the social justice crisis plaguing the city of Chicago. Satter attempted to raise a civil rights claim in Stevenson and Kent versus General Federal Savings and Loan. In this case, Satter took on the bankers, suggesting, among other things, the financial institutions involved in contract sales refused to lend to black buyers to purchase the very same property these banks were willing to lend money to white solicitors to purchase, thus directly preventing a black buyer the same opportunity as a white buyer. Unfortunately, this argument did not prevail, and the case was dismissed. The stress and trauma of these experiences took heavy tolls on all the parties involved. Many saw their health decline. Sadly, one of Satter's clients died of heart failure within 2 weeks after his case concluded. Unfortunately, Mark Satter fared no better. The stress and toll of running his practice to fight housing inequalities had a profound impact on his personal finances and his health. Satter passed away from heart failure in July 1965. He was 49 years old. Despite these setbacks, others did have some success with their legal battles, not by prevailing on the merits of their case, but by organizing and wearing down their opponents. Thanks for joining us this week. We'll take a break here, and when we return next week, we'll tell you about a courageous group of contract buyers who banded together to take on their corrupt contract sellers.